Well, I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, and I'm going to tell you a story about a more hopeful moment, perhaps in environmental politics, a moment of bipartisanship. But I'm here because I love the contrast between the public and the private faces of science. And if you only look at the public side of science, if you read research articles, you know that science is cool and rational and orderly, and it's a search for truth. And I get to read the private letters of scientists and their oral histories and all the sniping that they do that gets preserved in the archives. Come on out to the Science History Institute, you can do this too. And so I want to tell you the story about a musician and an athlete who came together to understand the chemistry of smog in Southern California in the 1940s. The musician is a man named Arnold Beckman. He is a staunch conservative. He comes from small town Illinois. He is a scientific instrument inventor and becomes an entrepreneur. He forms a company that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and he becomes the president of the LA Chamber of Commerce. And the athlete is a man named Arie Haagen-Smit. He's a Dutchman. He's immigrated from Utrecht. He's a Democrat, as many immigrants were in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. He is an avid boxer and an avid rower, and he's very competitive. And he's famous in the department. He's a biochemist. He's famous in the department of biology at Caltech for having the largest muscles. And everyone knows this up until about 1960, and after 1960, he becomes very involved in smog and pollution, air pollution politics. And so he starts wearing a jacket, and he looks very respectable, and no one knows how big his biceps are anymore. And this is very much the subject of his biographical memoir, The National Academy of Sciences. Give you a sense of the preoccupations of the Caltech biology faculty. So these are two men who are both chemists, but different in very many ways. So smog is a very clear problem, so to speak, in Southern California by the late 1940s. Elderly people are dying from smog. Healthy people, on some days, their eyes are watering, their lungs are irritated, they're coughing. It's obvious that this is a problem. And there's a local government agency called the Air Pollution Control District that has just been created in 1947, whose job it is to deal with this. The problem is they're not sure what smog is. It's clear that the California smog is different from the air pollution that affects the East Coast, which is mostly soot and coal smoke and stinky sulfur dioxide, but that doesn't seem to be what's the case in California. And so they hire Arnold Beckman, this chemist and instrumentation expert, to try and figure out what it is. And he goes to his old Caltech colleague, Haagen-Smit, who at the time is studying flavor chemistry. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with air pollution? And you'd be quite right. On the surface, not very much, but there's an experimental technique that Haagen-Smit is an expert in. And he's an expert in extracting tiny amounts of chemicals that have evaporated into the air. And so he basically grinds up hundreds and hundreds of pounds of pineapple, and then he puts a big fan on one side, and he blows air across, and then routes that air through a cold trap, cooled by liquid nitrogen, and extracts the volatile chemicals that have evaporated off of this pineapple. And then he uses those few little drops, and he does techniques in microchemistry to figure out what they are. And it turns out this works reasonably well to do the same thing, to understand what gunk is floated in the air in Southern California. So they take out the pineapple, and they suck about 500 liters of air on a really smoggy day through, and they come out with 2 or 3 drops of this brown goo. And then the question is, what is it? So Haagen-Smit starts to do some experiments, and he discovers it's peroxide material, which is these sort of organic acids that are made up from partially burned hydrocarbons. So it looks like cars, and automobile engines are probably part of what's responsible. So then, as now, the oil industry saw that there was some science that was challenging its business model, and they hired a scientist to try and cast doubt on this finding. This was a man named Abe Zerum from the Stanford Research Institute. And he then repeats the experiment, comes out with the same goo, smells it, says it doesn't smell, analyzes it, says it's not irritating to the eyes, and there you are. And Beckman, who can not only play the piano as a musician, but also knows how to play people, invites Abe Zerum to Caltech, invites Ari Hagenschmidt to Caltech, sits Hagenschmidt down next to him while Zerum gives his speech. And Zerum explains his findings and then says that it's such a shame that a chemist of the caliber of Ari Hagenschmidt could be so misled. And needless to say, Ari Hagenschmidt bristles and says, well, who is he to say that I am no good at what I do? So he takes, instead of going back to flavor research, he takes a year off to work for the Air Pollution Control District to work out the whole process by which the chemicals, the byproducts of engine exhaust are affected, interact with sunlight and nitrogen oxides to produce ozone, the chemical that's great in the stratosphere, but when it's at ground level, it irritates your lungs and it makes your eyes water. So he works out all of this information, and then that becomes the basis of a 25-year career as a world-renowned expert in the chemistry of air pollution and in the regulation of air pollution. So both Hagenschmidt and Beckman go on to be appointed by Richard Nixon to a scientific advisory panel that helps to advise the EPA, the newly founded EPA in the early 1970s, on how to implement the Clean Air Act. And ultimately, while air pollution today different kinds of air pollution today remain a big problem, the ozone, the chemical that makes the air brown and that irritates our lungs, is much less of a problem, thanks to the combination of careful research, effective government regulation, and the touchy pride of a Dutchman.